The reading is taken from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. Jesus calms a storm. On the evening of that same day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they left the crowd. The disciples got into the boat in which Jesus was already sitting, and they took him with them. Other boats were there too. Suddenly, a strong wind blew up, and the waves began to spill over into the boat, so that it was about to fill with water. Jesus was in the back of the boat, sleeping with his head on a pillow. The disciples woke him up and said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're about to die?" Jesus stood up and commanded the wind, "Be quiet." And he said to the waves, "Be still." The wind died down, and there was a great calm. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Why are you frightened? Have you still no faith?" But they were terribly afraid and said to one another, "Who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
Boats are not my favourite form of transport. Unless the water is a mill pond, I get dreadfully seasick. And so therefore I find it really curious that the metaphor that I always use about my safety being in God is lashed to the mast. Others, like Augustus Toplady, have spoken of the Rock of Ages, asking for it to cleft for him so that he could hide inside. In the Psalms, we read of God as our strong fortress, our rock. My metaphor came years ago when I was going through a really rough time and read a book where two people were on a boat, and the sailor of the two of them lashed the non-sailor to the mast, the most stable part of the ship. Even though the boat rocked and rolled, he was still safe. For me, that was a reminder from God that even though I had just faced a life-changing event, and it felt like everything in my life had fallen apart, God still held me. I was lashed to his mast. Our passage for today is found in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, and I read commentaries on all three to compare them and looked online to see what else I could find. In the process, I came across a song that we're not using today because it's a bit cheesy, but it's based on the passage of the stilling of the storm, and it came at it from a different angle. Basically saying, sometimes God stills the storm, and sometimes God stills you. Sometimes he might take away the trauma of life, and other times he holds you tight in the midst of it, stilling your heart and mind so that you can cope, giving you the faith to hang in there and know that you're lashed to the mast. The Israelites weren't a seafaring race. They left that to their neighbours in Phoenicia and Egypt. But there were references to the sea in their scriptures. The creation story, the parting of the Red Sea during the Exodus, Jonah and the whale, and the many descriptions of the chaos of the waters and the great sea monsters in the Psalms. However, the sea wasn't really an issue for the majority of the Jewish people, apart from those who lived near the Sea of Galilee. It could be still and calm 1 minute, and the next, it wasn't just blowing a hoolie, it was life-threatening. It's said that even today, you don't park your car in the car park next to the Sea of Galilee in a storm, because it's highly likely not to be there when the storm is over. So imagine what it was like in the time of Jesus, in a small wooden fishing boat in the middle of a sudden storm. Jesus had been teaching the crowds about the coming of the kingdom of God, the parable of the sower, the lamp on the stand, the mustard seed, how faith needed to grow. The crowds and the disciples had drunk it all in. I bet the disciples were feeling very self-righteous. Yes, they had faith, of course they did. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. Yet straight afterwards, when Jesus wanted them to sail across to the other side of the sea, that faith was put to the test. Remember that at least 4 of them in that boat with him were seasoned fishermen. They knew the Sea of Galilee. They had spent years learning to respect it. They knew how to keep their boat safe. But this time they were scared. This was the mother of all storms, and they were afraid that they were going to drown. You can imagine the panic and the shouting and the instructions to the other disciples about what to do as the wind and the rain lashed down upon them. And all the while, Jesus slept serenely with his head upon a pillow in the boat, totally unconcerned. You can understand their reaction. How can you sleep at a time like this? Don't you care that we're all going to die? Not long before, they'd been listening to Jesus explaining the parable of the sower to them. The seeds are like your faith. The seeds of faith fall on rocky ground, but they don't last very long. They're eaten by birds or they're choked by weeds. And the faith of the disciples was swept away by a storm. And Jesus wakes and calmly speaks to the wind and the waves and speaks them into silence and looks at the disciples and says, "Why were you so afraid? Where's your faith?" Tom Wright in his commentary says, this faith is simply a trust that Jesus is the sovereign one who has authority over the elements. And the disciples didn't have much of this faith. We now start to realize that other people, like the centurion at Capernaum, had a sharply focused and quite striking faith. And that Jesus's own followers, despite seeing all that he had done, weren't in the same league. It would be really easy to read this passage and say to yourself, good grief, if even the disciples haven't got enough faith, then what hope have I got? I mean, look at what they did. Jesus sent them out in pairs and people were healed and came to faith. Peter even walked on the water. If he questioned their faith, then there's no hope for me. Or you could look at it the other way around. If Jesus could use and love those scared disciples whose faith was in their boots, then he can use you and me. If we are lashed to the mast and trust him, he will see us through the storms of our lives. If we have faith, then God can use us in all kinds of ways that we would never have believed. If you had told the disciples on the boat that day that one day they would bring thousands of people to faith throughout the known world, they wouldn't have believed you. But Jesus takes our faith, the size of a mustard seed, and grows it into something remarkable. So how's your faith? Is life like a mill pond at the moment? Still and safe, and your faith is strong? Then pray for others who are struggling. Is the water getting a bit choppy and your faith is struggling a bit, then hear Jesus speak calm into your life. Or is it a full-on storm and you're lashed to the mast, clinging on for dear life? Put your faith in the one who will not let you go. If he can master the wind and the waves, if he can take on and defeat death, then he can see you through this storm. Sometimes he calms the storm, but sometimes he calms you and says, "Peace, be still."